After telling us about this intimate relationship, Althusser says that literature itself is one of the ideological state apparatuses which contribute to the process of reproducing the relations of production. We'll understand this a little more as we explain it. According to literature is one of the ideological state apparatuses which contribute to the process of reproducing the relations of production. In this sentence itself, there are a couple of terms that we must understand first. The first one is ideological state apparatuses. So this is a term which Althusser uses a lot in his work. In fact, it comes from a very influential essay that he wrote in 1971. And the title of this essay is Ideology and Ideological State Apparatuses. It's the essay that Althusser wrote in 1971. And in this essay, he basically talks about how ideology functions. So as we discussed in our previous classes on Lukács, ideology is something which is unconsciously ordering our lives. We cannot live our lives without being affected by ideology. But at the same time, we are also rather uncritical of it. We cannot choose to question ideology, or oftentimes we are not even aware of it. So it is like an unconscious framework within which we have to function in order to take part in social relationships. So if you look at capitalism, in capitalism there is this framework which is created by wealth itself, right? So there are people who have to sacrifice their mental health and physical health and all kinds of things in order to earn capital. And there are others who exploit that capital and gain power. So in the capitalist society, the entire political and social system is based on this sort of a power relationship, right? A distribution of power according to the means of acquiring wealth. But most of the time, the people who are inside this system, they do not even realize that they are being subjected to such a framework. And this is just one example of ideology. Ideology can take the form of many different kinds of things. Right? It can be a religious belief. It can be superstitious belief. It can be certain social, practices that we find very difficult to explain or to avoid. So through all these things, ideology is unconsciously ordering our lives. And ideology is essentially propagated through different kinds of institutions. And Althusser mainly divides these institutions into two categories. And one is ideological state apparatuses. Now, these are institutions which condition citizens to take part in the kind of social relationships which constitute society. For example, the education system of a state is considered to be one of the prime ideological state apparatuses. Right? So it tells the young citizen how they should function in society by teaching them history, teaching them literature, law, proper behavior. Through all these kinds of instructions, the school or the education system conditions people so that they become productive members of society. Other kinds of ideological state apparatuses are the the church, the religious institutions. They also tell us how to behave in society. They give us a belief to which we have to adhere. They give us customs. They give us rituals, and we don't question these rituals, right? They are just given to us, and we accept them without questioning. And that is a common characteristics of all ideology. We are often uncritical of ideological uh, positions. Now, the church, the school system, uh, even the hospital, even the medical systems are part of the ideological state apparatus. They tell you about how you have to, what you have to eat, what kind of exercise you have to do, so that your body is maintained in the perfect condition. Why? Because that is what the state requires. Right? The state requires its citizens to be productive and healthy, and therefore it gives them certain prescriptions. It gives them certain rules to follow, so that both the mind and the body are productive. Okay. But essentially, all kinds of these, ideological state apparatuses, they tell us how to, live our lives according to the kind of social relationships that are expected. Okay. Now, the other kind of state apparatuses, which Althusser identifies, are called repressive state apparatuses. These repressive state apparatuses, they too are ways of propagating ideology, but they differ from ideological state apparatuses in that these are coercive. They are coercive. That is, they force their ideology on you. They have certain ways of, forcing the citizens to accept the conditions of ideology, and otherwise they also have the power to punish you. For example, you have things like the penal system. You have a system of laws which tell you that if you kill somebody, you will be hanged. If you steal something, you will be thrown into the jail. So the penal system is a kind of a repressive state apparatus. Is a kind of a repressive state apparatus which uses a certain amount of power to force the citizen to behave in a certain way. Other kinds of things are, like the army. Right? Uh, if a state is, another country is declaring that some of the territory belonging to our country is theirs, what will we do? We will use our army to invade that particular country or that territory and impose our law, our rule, our ideology on that land. So the army becomes a kind of a institution which can use force, which can even take away the lives of people who stand up against them, so that a certain ideology can be propagated. So the army, the police, all these kinds of institutions are called the repressive state apparatuses. Now, what Althusser is going to say is that when it comes to literature, our question is regarding literature, right? That is the basic idea of this entire essay. We are going to look at, what is the relationship that literature has with ideology, right? And according to Althusser, literature is one of the ideological state apparatuses which contribute to the process of reproducing the relations of production. Literature represents and reproduces the relations of production. What does Althusser mean by this relations of production? Um, Basically, Althusser belongs to the Marxist school of thought, and in that school of thought, as we already saw, the entire basis of society is a kind of a class struggle, right? A class struggle between people who have capital and those who those who produce it for the people who have capital. And the entire structure of this kind of a society is based on production and consumption. Right? So we have the working class who, who they are the ones who expend their labor. And they can also be called the laboring class. They work. They basically they do physical work, or something which is uh, probably not creative. Whatever kind of work that the working class is forced to do, it is not creative work, right? But it is designed to produce something. They are producers. They produce something. So what they produce is actually commodities, various kinds of commodities, things, objects, materials. And these materials are taken and then they are sold in the market. And from that sale of commodities, there arises profit. And most of the profit is taken away by those who own the means of production. It's not given to the laborers themselves, but the profit is mostly enjoyed by those who own the modes of production. In a capitalist society, this class which owns the modes of production is called the bourgeois class. Bourgeois class. They are the ones who own the modes of production. So this kind of a relationship that exists between the working class and the bourgeois society, and the relationship between producers and consumers. Right? The bourgeois class are also called the consumer class. Why? Because they are able to use whatever excess capital that they have in order to buy commodities. Most of the time, these are commodities that they don't require, but what they desire. Right. So the bourgeois class is able to use the excess uh, capital that they have amassed to engage in consumption. They consume things. They buy these commodities, and uh, uh, you know, they basically they set up a kind of a lifestyle which is based on this consumption. And this kind of a lifestyle is something which is desired by the other classes as well, the laborers, the working class. Just hold on 1 second. Let me just take one call. Okay, so where were we? Yeah. So, so these kinds of relations that exist in society, especially in capitalist society, they are the ones who perpetuate this social system. Right. Without this kind of a relationship between the working class and the bourgeois class, and the bourgeois class, spending their excess capital in order to live a life of, luxury or consumerism, we wouldn't have such a system. So what Althusser is saying is that when it comes to literature, literature is one of the institutional state apparatuses which represents and reproduces this kind of social relation. So the kind of social relation that exists in society, that is represented and reproduced in literature. So now we come to the main question of this essay. Let's go back. Yeah. What are the implications of Althusser's theory of ideology on literature and also on criticism? Catherine Belsey was, most of her works are concerned with critical practice. In fact, her most famous work is titled Critical Practice, and this particular essay is taken from that work. So, her interest in this essay is to find out how this kind of ideology, uh, how these social relationships, how they affect literature, and how they can be understood through the critical readings of literature. So Catherine Belsey tells us that, according to Althusser, literature is not just myths and imaginary versions of social relationships. Right? It is not just imagination. It is not just you know just the sole creativity of the author. It is something more. Uh, it is an inscription of ideology. We cannot separate literature from ideology, and in fact, literature becomes a way through which ideology works on society. And um, we can write down this argument like this. Okay, so first of all, uh, literature is just not just myths and imaginary versions of real social relationships which constitute. This means that it is not just limited to imaginary narratives or the characters that we find in literature. They are not entirely just the product of somebody's imagination. They encode something more, especially when it comes to the classist fiction, just like we saw in Lukács. Catherine Belsey also is an admirer of this realism, the classic realism. So this classic realist literature of the 19th century, what that does is it does something very interesting. It interpellates reader. This term called interpellation. This is a term that we find again and again in Marxist criticism. And interpellation simply means calling or hailing. The meaning of interpellation is to call or to hail. You can even call it naming. So what this kind of literature does is, it calls the subject, it calls the reader as a subject. It assigns a certain, a certain position to the reader, and expects the reader to assume certain, characteristics that this position has. So what is this position? The position of the subject. The subject is, a complex term, and it should be understood in two different senses. And the rest of the essay is going to explain what the meaning of the subject is. The two meanings of the word subject is, one is the grammatical sense. Right? In a sentence, there are, in a sentence like, you know, let us say, Ram killed Ravana. Right? The subject of the sentence is Ram, right? The person who does the action, right? The person who is, the performer in a sentence. So that is one sense of the word subject. Somebody who does something, somebody who is acting or speaking or signifying or making something. On the other hand, there is also the meaning of subject as subject to something. Right? I am a subject of the Indian Constitution. Right? If I say a sentence like that, it means that I am somebody who has to obey the rules of a certain system. So both of these senses are a little bit contradictory. On the one hand, the subject is somebody who does something, somebody who is able to bring about something, some action. But on the other hand, what the subject is somebody who is subjected to certain rules and regulations, somebody who has to behave in a certain predetermined manner. So both of these meanings will be reconciled, and we will understand what the subject is a little more as we move on. But classic realist literature, what it does is, it gives the position of the subject to the reader. So it makes the reader into a subject. And along with this addressing of the subject, along with calling the reader as the subject, the classic realist literature also propagates a certain ideology. So literature becomes a vehicle through which the ideology of the state is propagated, reproduced, and transmitted to individuals. In fact, literature plays a very crucial role in making us into the subjects of the state. Right? So without literature, or without language, it will not be possible for any individual to become a subject of the state. So that is what Catherine Belsey will explain. So it interpolates the reader, that is calls the reader as a subject, and offers the reader the position of subject in ideology. This position is also, it can also be defined as the place from which the text is most obviously intelligent. What this means is, when we are reading a text, in order to understand the meaning of the text, you as the reader must make certain assumptions. Right? Without making these assumptions, the text will not make sense to you. Suppose you are reading a text in the English language, and the language itself contains a set of assumptions about the meaning of words, about how the words are to be arranged in sentences. If you as a reader do not agree to these assumptions, you will not be able to derive any kind of meaning from the text. The same is with any other kind of literature. When reading a Malayalam novel or a Malayalam poem, you you should make certain, you should accept certain conditions which are set by the text. And these conditions come from the structure of the Malayalam language and also from the kind of society that speaks that language. Right? So certain usages, certain kinds of idioms, certain kinds of similes that we use in Malayalam, they will not have acceptability, or they will not have the same kind of meaning when presented to somebody else, or who does not share in that kind of a knowledge. Okay, so when a reader makes the attempt to read a text, a reader is also making an attempt to accept the kind of assumptions under which that text is written. Okay, so it makes the reader. What does the text do? If you are the reader of a text, you are also being made into a person who most obviously understands the content of the text. Okay, did you get it? So if you are reading, let us say, the novels of Sherlock Holmes, then the text, what does the text assume? The text makes you into a reader who understands and accepts the kind of social conditions, the kind of practices that were prevalent in Victorian London. Right? So once you understand those things, then the text makes obvious sense to you. Okay, or if you are reading Hamlet, what does the text do to you? The text makes you into somebody who understands Shakespeare's use of certain philosophies like procrastination. It makes you into a person who accepts the value of the relationship between a mother and a son, because Hamlet does everything in order to kind of preserve the sanctity of his relation to his mother, right? So all of those things are foisted onto you. Right? They are placed onto you as the reader, and the text makes you into that kind of a subject. Okay. So that is one way through which a text becomes a vehicle for ideology. So now we come to a bit more detailed discussion of what ideology is. So according to Althusser, ideology is, it is both imaginary as well as real. Right? It is actually, it contains both imaginary as well as real things. And one way to understand it is as a range of representations concerning the real relationships in which people live. So what is ideology? It's a range of representations this is what does this sentence mean? Let us take an example. Let us take any kind of a social custom that our society has. Let us say marriage, right? So when we think of marriage in our society, we have a range of representations of what marriage is. So marriage is, what marriage is something which differs throughout a range. So based on religion, you might have a certain kind of a marriage. Based on where you're residing, you might have a certain kind of a marriage. Even within a religion, according to the geographical location that you have, you might have different kinds of customs which are associated with it. Now, all of these things, they are they are not determined by any one person. They are things which are a part of the society, which have evolved through the process of social formation. and where are they contained? Right. Our idea of marriage is not written down anywhere. Okay. So it is something which gradually evolves as well, and it depends on each particular instance of that custom. For example, since the coronavirus, has happened, the idea of what marriage is has changed a lot. So before this pandemic, a marriage used to be, a huge social affair, right? Hundreds of people used to gather together, and there would be a lot of conversations. There would be a lot of exchanges happening. People coming and exchanging gifts. All of these things used to be a part of marriage. But uh, as society underwent a kind of a tragedy, a kind of a disaster, uh, this particular social institution has also been transformed. Right? Marriage is no longer seen as a huge gathering. Right? People try to limit the number of people who are present in it, and it has also become a more simpler affair, and a huge part of it has become um, you know uh, transformed due to the influx of technology. Nowadays, we live stream our weddings to our friends through YouTube or whatever, and a lot of our friends, will take part in that social custom through technology. So, whenever we have any kind of practice, it exists as a range of representations. There is no one ideal marriage. Right? There is no one ideal instance of any kind of um, what ritual. It exists as a range of representations which are practiced by society. Now, what does literature do? Literature also presents a range of representations. Okay. So if you have, um, a kind of a novel which deals with, revenge, it gives you one particular instance of revenge, right? But there might be yet another novel which gives you another example of how a character takes revenge. So, like this, literature gives us, a lot of examples, and through these lots of examples, a certain range of what it means to have to take revenge on somebody is created in our minds. So, when we watch a lot of movies or when we read a lot of books, we are actually being conditioned into certain subjects who understand the range of meanings which these particular things have in our society. Okay. So, what is our understanding of love? It is something which is conditioned in us through the movies, through the books, through the songs, through the through the conversations that we have with others, right? So all these things become uh, kinds of certain kinds of vehicles through which a certain unconscious idea about that thing is formed in the subject. Okay. So that is what literature does. Now, Althusser goes on to say, ideology is not the system of real relations, but it is the imaginary relation of those individuals, the real relations in which they live. What is the meaning of this? Ideology is not the system of real relations, but it is the imaginary relation of those individuals to the real relations in which they live. Um, One way to understand it is by, uh, you know, looking at an example. Um, Suppose you are, you are walking along the road, and you see a policeman standing there, right? You recognize that it is a policeman from the uniform that the policeman is wearing, you know, from the name badge or whatever, right? And you see a jeep nearby, which is also another symbol of the policeman's authority. And um, in your mind, you already have an idea about how to behave with the policeman. Right? You, in your mind, you have this conception that the policeman is an authority figure, right, who has certain power. So naturally, you know, because of that imaginary, examples that you have in your mind, because you have already, undergone many instances where you might have had to interact with other policemen, you unconsciously you assume a certain stance. Right. So if you're going on a bike or something, if a policeman is there, and asks you to stop, you will immediately do that, right? Because you know that this is what is expected of you. Right? So where is ideology in this particular situation? The ideology is not there in the actual interaction that you have with that policeman, but it is in the imaginary relationship that you have to the police in general. Right. Ideology is there. It is that which conditions you to behave in such a way when you recognize that this is a policeman. Okay. So it is the imaginary relation to those individuals to the real relationships in which they live. So the real situation is your actual meeting with a person, right, on the street. But that is conditioned in a certain way when you recognize that this person is a policeman by something which is already there as part of your psyche. And that imaginary thing which conditions you to behave in a certain way is ideology, right? So that is why it is called an imaginary relation. So in your mind, you have an imaginary construction about how it is that you should behave in a certain situation. And that imaginary, conditioning is ideology. Okay. So the same thing can be interpreted through other examples. Right? When you enter into an exam hall, right? If you come to the college and you go to the the auditorium for your exams, right? Your behavior is dictated in a certain way because you know how it is that you should behave in an exam hall. But later on, after the exam is over, if you are having some sort of a cultural program in the same auditorium, then you behave in a different way. The auditorium remains the same, but your cultural, conditioning has led you to behave in two different ways. In an exam hall, you behave in a certain way. You are not allowed to, talk to others or bring certain things into the exam hall. But the same sort of restrictions might not apply when that same location is transformed into a venue for a cultural event or a party. Um, so that thing which conditions you is called ideology. So what is ideology? Ideology is defined by Althusser as uh, both a real and an imaginary relation to the world. Okay, it is called real. It is called real because it has tangible effects on relations. And it is imaginary. It is also imaginary because it is unconscious. Not only is it unconscious, it is also, one of the features of ideology is that it discourages people from fully understanding that it is ideological. We do not question ideology most of the time, and most of the time we are not even aware of the fact that we are acting according to a certain ideology. So it is imaginary because it is unconscious, and also because it discourages people from fully understanding how it works. Ideology is something which discourages you from actively investigating and finding out how it functions. So where does ideology reside? Ideology resides in all that is obvious to us, all that we hesitate to question. So this includes commonplace beliefs, truisms, philosophies, and religion. So all of these things are parts of our life, and we most often we do not question why certain people do these things. Right? We say that, oh, this is the practice, this is the custom, this is what is done. So when people think like that, we do not think that there is a reason for it. And that is because most of the time this is all obvious to us, right? It is already given to us as a part of our role in this society, that we must accept these kind of things. So ideology is something which is inherent in all of us. It resides in all in ourselves, in our characters, and it dictates certain obvious truths to us, certain things that are obvious. Tulsar also says it is the necessary condition of action within the social formation. So without ideology, without these things trying to sort out or manage the kind of things that we accomplish in society, the way society functions will not be possible. Right? Without ideology, unconsciously directing the way that we function, our function will be too haphazard. Right? It will be without order. Suppose everybody behaves according to their own individuality or their own individual will, then there would be no order. Right? There would be no ideological conditioning of society, and every person will behave in every situation differently, right? So there will not be any kind of uniformity, there will not be any kind of order, and society will plunge into a state of chaos. So ideology is in fact at least partially required to make sure that some kind of action is possible in the society. In order to accomplish anything inside a society, we need an ideology. Okay. So ideology also becomes something which is essential. It is a necessary condition for accomplishing some sort of action, any kind of action within society. Okay. So we said already that ideology it prevents people from questioning it, and often the way that ideology prevents people from questioning is it is not through presenting absolute truths, but it is by presenting a range of uh, you know conditions or range of answers, right? So basically, we can say that ideology obscures the real conditions of life by presenting partial truths or a set of omissions and gaps rather than lies. And they appear to provide answers and they appear to solve contradictions, but in fact, they are simply drawing your attention away from the kind of contradictions and uh, lack of truth that there is in situations. For example, let us take any kind of practice that we do, right? In our societies, we are taught to uh, respect our elders, right? So that is something which is accepted by most societies, right? We respect our elders, and as an explanation for why we do this, they say many things that elders have, more experience, or you know, they are they are to be respected because of their, worldly wisdom. Right? Uh, but then, in reality, there is no logical reason why we should respect somebody just because they are older. Right? Just because somebody is older doesn't mean that they are automatically entitled to any kind of behavior from anybody. Right? But since this is something which is conditioned by most societies, it is also something which is not questioned. So when we are questioned, the answers that we get might be, this is what is the custom. This is the custom of our society that must be followed. So through a series of partial explanations or partial truths, uh, ideology tries to obscure, it tries to hide, the real motives of why it works. Okay, so where does ideology come from? That is another question that Althusser tries to answer. Ideology doesn't have any single origin. It has no creators. Ideology does not have any single origin. It has no creators or owners. It is merely supported and reproduced in institutions called ideological state apparatuses. And the function of these institutions called ideological state apparatuses, they are to persuade us to consent to the existing kind of social relations, right? So the role of a school, the role of a church, or the role of a court of law, it is to persuade you, it is to convince you to live in a certain way. Okay, and that is how ideology is transmitted and propagated in society. Now, the central institutional state apparatus, the central ideological state apparatus is the education system. This education system, it prepares children to accept their role in society by inculcating certain value systems into them. It tells them that in society, such and such a thing is considered right, and such a thing is considered, something which is wrong or a taboo. And then it gives them examples from history. It teaches them, social studies, various ways in which the society is organized. And through all these things, and along with other institutional state apparatuses, it creates the individual into a subject, somebody who accepts that ideology. So what are some of the other ideological state apparatuses? We have things like the law, we have media, we have arts, we have family, we have literature. So all of these are institutional state apparatuses which, along with the education system, fashions you into a subject in the society. Okay, so in the essay it is mentioned that ISAs represent and reproduce the myths and beliefs necessary to induce people to work within the existing social formation. Okay, so is this much clear? Is this is the idea of what ideology is clear, or does it need more explanation?
It's clear, sir.
It's clear, sir.
Okay. So let's go to the next section of this essay, in which Catherine Belsey is telling us about the subject. So this is the second part, part 2. Okay. So the main question that Catherine Belsey is asking in this section is, what is the subject? Okay. And what the subject is it is the destination of all ideology. All ideology that is produced in the state, it is meant for the subject. Right? In fact, it is intended to create the subject. So what is this subject? It is what is constructed as a result of being exposed to all these ideologies. So let us just write this down point by point. What is the subject? The subject is the destination of all ideology. Ideology constructs people as subjects. The subject is what speaks or signifies. Okay, so this last one, the last one tells us that a subject in society, a subject is supposed to be an individual, or it can be a collection of individuals who are able to voice their own opinions, who are able to create meaning, who are able to engage in discourse. So in society, a subject becomes somebody who is capable of signifying. Okay. At this, at this instance itself, we can understand that there is some connection between being a subject and using language, and that will be developed, much more in the coming section of this essay. But at this time, you just have to understand that a subject is what is constituted by ideology. Right? Okay. Now, Catherine Belsey is explaining this with reference to capitalism. What does it mean to be a subject in capitalism? So, in order for any individual to become a member of a capitalist structure, of a capitalist society, they have to accept certain, conditions, or they are given certain values. And according to capitalism, you are always a free individual. Right? You are always an autonomous, unique, distinctive, distinguishable, and irreplaceable individual. Right? And this is something which they are led to believe, that they are free. Right? Uh, One of the essential conditions of a consumerist system is that you have the power of choosing. The choice is yours. Okay, so when we go to a supermarket, we have the choice of consuming any of the things that are on offer. Right? So it is a way of the consumerist system telling us that the choice is yours to make. But once again, it is also forcing you to choose. Right? It is not giving you the option to choose beyond the number of choices that are being offered to you. Right? When you go to a supermarket looking for some item, you only have these many choices which are available. Right? And you have to choose from among them. No other alternative is there. Right? So while capitalism or any kind of ideology, it tries to give you certain attributes, certain values. These values are also being given to you so that you become obedient, docile subjects in that situation, so that you freely accept your freedom. You are given a certain amount of freedom, or you are led to believe that you are free individuals. But the reason why that is being done is simply because society wants you to freely accept your role in society. Okay. So that is how capitalism functions. In capitalism, people obviously realize, it is something which is obvious, just like the other obvious things that ideology tells you. It is so obviously given to you that you do not think of questioning it. Okay, we in our society, we think of ourselves we are all autonomous, we are all free, we are all unique. None of us are similar, right? So I have my own taste, you have your own taste, but ultimately, these are all given to us, or these are all attributed to us simply so that we belong to this society, right? So it is obviously felt that people are autonomous, unique, distinguishable, irreplaceable, sensitivity on which they act or believe. This is okay. So according to Althusser, uh, the basic assumption that we have that we are all important contributors, we are all important parts of the social structure, is something that we are led to believe because of ideology. So the belief, the idea that we are unique individuals who have subjectivity, who act according to our own choices, that is something which ideology wants us to believe. Now, coming back to um, this particular point about how subjectivity or subject is what speaks or signifies. Somebody who is capable of signifying, of creating some discourse. That is the idea which is developed a little more in the coming section. And it begins with Catherine Belsey asking us a question: Is subjectivity the source of meaning? Okay. So when you are reading a book, according to the reader response theory that we have just we just saw in the previous class, according to that theory, it is the reader who makes that configurative meaning of the text that we discussed yesterday, right? So the meaning of the text arises from the reader himself or herself, and the reader becomes the source of the meaning. But then here in this essay, Catherine Belsey tells us that it is not actually we cannot just say that we ourselves are the generators of this meaning. Right? Though we as individuals are reading this text, the meaning itself is not coming from us. Where does it come from? According to Catherine Belsey and Althusser, meaning is something which is ideological, right? Meaning is something which is already unconsciously given to us, right? And how is that? It is something which arises from language itself. Okay. So subjectivity cannot be the source of meaning, but the source of meaning is language itself. And that is something, that is a view which comes from Saussurean linguistics. So, I don't think you did you have linguistics in your BA class? Uh, if you did, yeah, okay. Then you would have studied about how the Swiss linguist called Saussure, he came up with a theory of how language works. So according to him, um, the relationship between a word and its meaning is arbitrary. Right. So if you have a word like cat, the word itself is just a sound, a collection of sounds. Some consonant sounds and some vowel sound. Right. It is just a coming together of these three sounds. Now, why does that word, that collection of sounds, have an association with a particular animal? Cat, right? Why does it have that association? according to Saussure, this association is purely arbitrary. Right? It is just by random choice. It is just that in the English language, this particular group of sounds are randomly associated with that meaning. Right. So like that, all words are randomly chosen. Right. Except one exception is onomatopoeic words, sounds like boom or crash. Such words sometimes they have an association with the kind of sound that is uh, linked to an action. But except that, um, most of the words in a linguistic system, they are random or arbitrary. Right? And um, also another thing that Saussure tells us is how um, when you have a word, the meaning that is associated with that word is determined by all the things that are not associated with the word. Okay, so that is, suppose you have a series of words like this: apple, orange, grape, mango. Okay, so if there is a particular meaning associated with the word apple, that is not because this word is directly connected to a certain fruit, but it is because this word signifies that it is not orange, not grape, not mango. Okay, so it is it is actually a system of differences. Okay, so the meaning of the word apple simply not orange, not grape, not mango. Okay, did you get it? So apple itself does not have any meaning associated to it. It is simply connected to other words in the system. And what about orange? The meaning of orange is simply not apple, not grape, not mango, not coconut, etc. So every word in the language is put into a kind of an elaborate network by which we only know the relationship of that word to other words. There is no real relationship between the word to an object. That relationship is purely arbitrary. It is something which is simply accidental. The only real thing about language is that it exists in a kind of a tissue of relations, interrelations. Okay. So coming back to this question, is the source of meaning subjectivity? According to uh, Catherine Belsey and also another theorist called Emile Benveniste, subjectivity itself, we are looking for the source of meaning. And when asking the question, is subjectivity the source of meaning? Emile Benveniste says, subjectivity itself is merely a function of language. It is because of language that we are able to understand ourselves as subjects. It is language that provides the possibility of subjectivity. That is, by enabling the speaker to position himself or herself as subject of a sentence. This I. So the question becomes not whether subjectivity is the origin of meaning, but rather it is language which gives you subjectivity, right? So in any kind of situation in society, when you think that you are signifying something, you are creating something, you are speaking something, it is not really coming from you or I, right? That you and I are merely certain positions in language. What is you and I? These pronouns, you and I, these are certain positions or certain, uh, a place which language has created with which we identify. Okay, so when I am speaking something and I say the sentence, uh, I love ice cream. In that sentence, I is a certain linguistic placeholder. It is just an empty cell where I am identifying myself with that position in that sentence. So it is language which which gives us the possibility of identifying ourselves as a subject. So without language, without the possibility of identifying myself with that position, I cannot be a subject. Okay. So whenever we form a concept of selfhood, whenever we form a concept of myself, it is only because I can distinguish myself from all the things that are not myself. Just like in our example, I can distinguish the meaning of apple only because I am able to distinguish it from other things. So likewise, I can distinguish the meaning of I by opposing it, by opposing it to everything that is not I. Similarly, in when we enter into some kind of a dialogue with others, right? When we have a dialogue with I and you, because we are having a conversation, then the person that is me, I will identify with this pronoun while I'm speaking to the other person, and then when that person is speaking to the okay, I'll just say there are we have a conversation between A and B. So first, when A is speaking to B, A will be I, okay, and B will be you. So let us say the first conversation, the first sentence in this conversation is something like, uh, "I haven't seen you since 2006," something like that. In this sentence, A is I and B is you. Okay, and then in reply to that sentence, in the second sentence, B will be speaking. That is because I had to move to Germany. Okay, something like this. So in this sentence, B is identifying with I. So the role of I and you are reversed. Okay, so the polarity, the polarity of I and you can be exchanged during the course of a discourse or a dialogue. It is only because I and you are certain empty categories. These are just like empty vessels into which at each sentence we are pouring our identity. Okay, so while one person is talking to another person, while A is talking to B, A is in fact identifying himself with the word I, and A is causing B to identify with the word you in that sentence. When the sentence is reversed, this polarity is also switched. So what this means is subjectivity and language use subjectivity and language use are inextricably linked. Okay. So the source of meaning is not from it is not from our selfhood or identity. It is rather from language. So language is what offers a possibility of meaning. Okay, without language, meaning would not be possible. An individual can produce meaning only by taking up the position of subject in language. So only by entering into a certain position which is offered by language can you make meaning. Okay. So the essay quotes Derrida on this. Derrida is a famous postmodern philosopher. According to Derrida, so in order to become a subject, what must an individual do? Individual must enter into a kind of a position which is offered by the language. It is only by entering into that position that you become a subject. And where does this entry into selfhood or subjecthood come from? And that is explained by psychoanalysis. Right. Because essentially what Catherine Belsey is going to say is that you become a subject in society only when you learn how to speak. Okay. And that happens soon after the mirror stage in your psychoanalytical development. In psychoanalysis, especially in Lacanian psychoanalysis, there is a certain stage in the development of a child when the child is able to recognize himself or herself as an individual. Okay. Initially, when a child is born, the child has no idea that there are certain boundaries. So the child does not recognize that he or she has a definite beginning and an end. But when the child undergoes development, gradual development, psychological development, eventually it reaches a stage called the mirror stage. And symbolically, this is represented as the child seeing its own reflection in a mirror. So when a child sees something like that, the child understands that, I am a unified whole. Right? I have a definite beginning and a definite end. And the image that the child sees in the mirror becomes a kind of a representation of his self or herself. And it is with this representation that the child identifies. But actually, this representation is not the truth, because the image that you see in the mirror is just an image. Right? It is not the real thing. So when you are a child who is seeing your own image in the mirror, and you choose to identify yourself with that image, you are in fact committing a misrecognition. It is not, you are not identifying yourself with a true self, but only an imaged or imaginary self of your own body. So it is only through that process that the child gains a sense of selfhood. But soon after that, when the child begins to speak, the child does something similar. The child learns to identify himself or herself with the word I. Okay. So when the child is using language, the child learns that the word I signifies myself. Okay. So the child lets himself or herself become a part of that system of language. So while I am speaking, I am agreeing to the condition set by language that the word I is a representative of myself. So what am I doing? I am sacrificing all the limitless possibilities I have, and I am agreeing to be represented by this one word. So that is almost like I am agreeing to become a subject of the state. Right? I am agreeing to take part in all the unconscious ideology of the state by agreeing to identify myself with this existence. So that is how Catherine Belsey will link language with ideology. Right? Language and ideology become almost interchangeable. So that is something that we will see in a little more detail in the next section, which is the third part of this essay. I think there are a total of 5 parts of this essay, and third part is called psychoanalysis, and this deals with how during the development, the psychological development of a child, the child becomes a subject. Okay. How the child becomes the subject which is inscribed in language. By accepting language, the child becomes, a participant of that whole ideological apparatus. So that we will discuss in the next class. So what you have to do before that is read the first 2 parts of this essay by yourself, and prepare a short summary of this. I will send you the essay right after the class. Go through the first 2 parts of this essay, prepare a short summary, and send it to me. Okay, I will treat this as one of the assignments. And then in the next class, we'll take up the remaining 2 parts of the essay. Okay. So before we leave, I think it might be useful if I just tell you how to, I can tell you how to search for academic articles, because I think it was Albina who asked me how to find all these articles which are referenced in many of your texts. So if you are in the college, you have access to various databases like JSTOR, Muse, etc. And using those databases, you can search and download articles, which is perfectly legal. But if you are working from home, you don't have access to these resources. So there are certain websites which give you free access to these academic articles, and you might already know these websites, but using them you will be able to access learning resources. So I'll just show you a couple of these websites and how you can use them. The first one is for books. For books, the website that you can use is called LibGen. You might already know this website. Let me just show it to you. Okay. So what you can do is you can just Google LibGen. and it will probably be the first result that you get, and you'll be taken to this website, and here you can you can type in the name of the book or the author that you want. So let us try to find Catherine Belsey. Just type in Catherine Belsey and click enter, and immediately I will see a list of books. So here the title of the book is given, the author is given, the year of publication, the publisher, number of pages, and the size of the book. Now, the particular book that I am interested in is Critical Practice, because that is the book from which this particular essay has been taken. So let me just click on that. I'll click on Critical Practice, and I'll be taken to another page like this. And at the bottom of this page, you have a description of the book and all, a small summary of the book and everything is given. But here, if you see, you will be given a number of links, okay, under mirrors. So each of these links will let you download the book. So you can just select any one of these. I'll just select the first one. When you click on that link, you will be taken to a page, and from this page you can just click this button called Get. Okay, and by clicking on that button, you will be able to download the book. Immediately the book will start downloading. In case it doesn't start to download, in case it doesn't work for you, what you have to do is you can go back and click another one of these links, and you will be able to download it. But right now I am able to download it. You will not be able to see the download. Let me change the sharing to the entire screen. You might be able to see. Okay, so after I clicked on that, my book was downloaded. I can now just open the book by clicking on it, and this is the book. And our particular essay, the essay that we are reading right now, this is the fourth essay of this book, addressing the subject, and you will be able to find this essay inside the book. In fact, you got the entire book. Now, that is the use of LibGen. You can use LibGen to download books. Now, the other website which you can use to download articles is called Sci-Hub. Again, once more, let us go to Google. I'll just open a new tab. And in Google, you can just type in Sci-Hub. SCIHUB. SCIHUB. And again, the first result that you get is this particular website called Sci-Hub. Here also you have a search box, and here what you have to do is you have to enter the DOI or the URL of the particular research article that you want to read. So how do I find this DOI or research, the URL of the article? For that, first you have to know the name of the article. So let us go back to Catherine Belsey's essay and book, and at the end of the book, let us see, you will get a list of references. Okay, I just took a page from the end of the book, and here you have a list of references. Okay, so let me try to find a research article. Okay, this seems like a good research article. Realism and Cinema, Notes on Some Brechtian Thesis, written by Colin McKay in 1974. It's a rather old article. Perhaps we'll be able to find it. Now let us just copy this, and I'll copy it, and I will go to Google. I'll just directly paste and search for it. So if that article is available, usually we will get you will get the link to that article in the first result. Here, that article itself is available, I think. This is a PDF file because the word PDF is written here. So by clicking this link, I'll be able to directly download it, but we are interested in using Sci-Hub. So when we are trying to use Sci-Hub, what we have to do is, first we find the JSTOR article that we want to download. So this is a particular, so this is an article in JSTOR, and normally because JSTOR is a paid site, it will not let you access the full article, but it will also give you a DOI, right? This is called the DOI link. I think the full form of DOI is Data Object Identifier or something, right? This is usually a link which is given for every research article. So all you have to do is just copy this DOI from any article on JSTOR. Just copy that link, go to Sci-Hub, and then paste that DOI link. Okay, this particular DOI link, and then you can click the open button. So immediately, that particular article will be opened. So here you have that entire article. In Sci-Hub, all you will be able to access is the the summary and the maybe the one or two pages. But if you copy that DOI from JSTOR and you search on Sci-Hub, you will be able to download the entire article. From here, you can just click the download button, and you'll get the option to save this article anywhere. Right? You can save it, and it will start downloading. So these two websites, LibGen as well as Sci-Hub, mostly they will be sufficient for you to find any kind of articles. Yet another way to find the DOI of an article is by going to Google Scholar. Let's go to the search for Google Scholar, SCHOLAR. You can go to this website, Google Scholar. And here also you can type in, the name of your author. And you will get a list of results. So these are all books. If it is a book, the tag book will be mentioned at the beginning. Now look at this. This is a particular research article which is published on JSTOR, Postmodern Love, Questioning the Metaphysics of Desire. If you want this particular article, you can try to copy this link, copy link address, go to Sci-Hub once more. I'll just go to Sci-Hub, paste that link. So now I am pasting the JSTOR link. Okay, this is not the DOI link. This is the JSTOR link itself. And let me try to open it. Let me try if it is available. And yes, it is available. It is just taking a while to open, but the article itself is available. And you can find Catherine Belsey's article. Okay. So using a combination of Google Scholar, Sci-Hub, JSTOR, and LibGen, you will be able to find 95% of whatever research article that you are looking for. So just try it out. If you have any doubt, if it is not working for you, let me know. And if you still can't find an article using these resources, let me know, and I will search the official databases that we have access to, and maybe it is available in one of them. Okay. So I hope this is helpful. Try it out and let me know. Okay, then if there is nothing else, we will meet in the next class. Do the assignment that I gave you. Just read the first 2 sections of that essay and prepare a kind of a summary and send it to me. Okay.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
Okay.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.